Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our colloquium today. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Carl Fogel. Carl is currently at Open Text Strategies, but has an impressive history in the open source and free software movements. Was it 1997 that you added read-only support to CVS repositories?
Wow. Yes,
Okay.
and thank you.
Yeah.
Nobody ever knows that.
Well, it was on the biography you directed me to. So Carl, among other things, has been involved in initiatives like that. He was a founding developer of Subversion, was at CollabNet, has been at Google, Canonical, where he helped launch Launchpad, is currently at Open Text Strategies, and I've gotten to know Carl a little bit through some work that he's doing on Worldwide Telescope. He's also the author of a book called Producing Open Source Software, which is an outstanding book and is now going through has been successfully kickstarted for a second edition. And today he's in town to give this colloquium and also to be a mentor at Hack Illinois. So I am excited to introduce to you Carl Fogel. Thank you.
Thanks. This is working? Everyone can hear in the back as well? I see nods. That's great. So you've probably all heard of that famous Benjamin Franklin pamphlet, Rules by Which a Great Empire May Be Reduced to a Small One. He really pulls it off. He gives instructions for how to ruin your empire in the negative, like, do this and your empire will get smaller. I thought of doing this presentation that way based on the title, and I just give you instructions for how to really drive your open source project into the ground and make it die. And then I thought, okay, yeah, but then people are gonna you just remember what the speaker said directly, and so you might actually go away and do that. So I'm not gonna give the presentation in that style. I'm going to give you the positive advice that I think is how to run an open source project well, despite the title. So please don't reverse the polarity, coming out, because then you really will ruin your project. Matthew already gave a very generous biographical blurb. I was a little bit embarrassed when he mentioned the kickstarted second edition of this book, which is very close to done, and it's all in that repository. It's all online. Like if you go to producingoss.com, the second edition is there. It's basically done. I'm about to hand it off to my editor at O'Reilly Media, and they'll hopefully bring it out this year. But if you were to go into a bookstore now and get the Treeware, it would be like this 10-year-old book that does not incorporate many of the things I've learned in the open source consulting I've done since writing that first edition. I also am glad that he mentioned the Worldwide Telescope project, which I worked on the open sourcing of with him and Doug Roberts, who's sitting right here, and is a great project, and you should all try it out, especially if you're interested in astronomy. So for the last, I don't know, depending on how you count, 3 to 5 years, I've been doing consulting for organizations trying to launch new open source projects, get involved in open source projects that already exist, very often take in-house software and open source it when it was not written originally as open source. And many of the clients have been government agencies, hence this slide. I do always debate when I talk about my work with governments between this slide and this one, but that's kind of what it's like. The bureaucracy involved in getting any decisions made and anything happening it's quite surprising if you come from the tech industry and the kind of fast-moving Silicon Valley atmosphere of start up quick, fail fast. Government does not believe in failing fast. They believe in failing slowly and imperceptibly. So we're trying to make open source and government at least go differently. So, don't remember why I put that there. Here are some ideas for how to make your open source project not fail and not do so imperceptibly. The first is, this is the most common mistake. We see it over and over. We have even seen it repeated. When I say we, I'm talking about Open Text Strategies, of whom, by the way, Cecilia Donnelly is sitting here in the front row, and can vouch that she has seen clients make these mistakes over and over. An organization will come to us and say, we've got this thing, we're going to do it open source. And we always start getting suspicious at that moment in the phone call. What do you mean, do it open source? Well, we're writing it, and as soon as it's ready, we're going to open source it. And at that point, Cecilia and I both sort of like, oh no, not this conversation again. If you are going to develop open source software, you intend for it to be released open source, be open source from the moment you start writing the software. So many things go wrong, more than you would expect go wrong if you don't do it that way. You will have checked into your repository various passwords, API keys, and other configuration secrets that are not supposed to be part of the code tree. They're only supposed to be part of an individual deployment, like your Google Maps key, your various authorization keys, whatever. Programmers always check those into the repository until one day they realize the repository is going to be public, at which point you have this weird choice. Do we go back and change all our API keys so that when we open the door on the repository, even if someone goes back in the history and they see the old secrets, that won't hurt us? Or do we top skim, cut off all our history and just take the current, most recent version of the code and open source that and start with a new history, thus losing all the commit history we had? Neither choice is very appealing. If you had been developing the open from the beginning, everyone would have said before they checked a secret into the repository, wait, I shouldn't do that because that's going to be on the front page of Hacker News tomorrow morning. So I won't do that. You will discover that the sample data that is being used to help developer deployments test and reproduce bugs and stuff comes from live data that someone actually was using, and that really it shouldn't, people's names and phone numbers or whatever kind of information it is actually in your data sample set in the repository. Bug tickets, if the bug tracker wasn't open to the public from the beginning of the project, developers will say all sorts of things in the conversation threads in the bug tracker. They'll file reports that contain people's social security numbers. They'll say uncomplimentary things about a particular client or development partner if they think the bug tracker is private. It becomes a water cooler. It's okay for a bug tracker, in fact, it's great in an open source project for the bug tracker to become a water cooler, but it has to be a friendly water cooler that people are not saying offensive things in because they know that it's public. Similarly with comments in the code, developers will just say things in there that are very frank unless they already feel that this is performative, that they're in a sense on stage because the project is open. Also, and the correspondence of the development team being unpublishable, that sounds like it's the same as the previous two, like, oh, they're going to say nasty things in their emails. But the issue here is, yeah, they'll say things that aren't suitable for publication, but that really hurts you more than you think because the email correspondence, the mailing list archive of the development team during development is a valuable resource for people who want to learn about the code later. By the way, I should have asked Matthew at the beginning of this presentation, how long am I presenting for?
Oh, you've got about another 40 minutes.
Another 40 minutes about? Okay, I will adjust accordingly. I think it was a plan for about that, but then I was like, oh, I could spend a long time on this slide. What kind of trouble am I in? So you want all the places where developers discuss things, whether it's the bug tracker, whether it's a separate mailing list, a wiki, chat rooms, whatever those things are, as much as possible, you want them to be archived. Some IRC channels have a policy of not having public archives because then people feel more free to shoot the breeze in there. That's fine. People just keep personal archives. But anything that can reasonably be archived and that people participating in it expect to be archived, keep that archive and have it be online and available all the time, because later someone will be doing a search on some weird behavior that they found in your software, and there's nothing in the bug tracker about it, and there's nothing on Stack Overflow, and none of the developers who are currently involved in the project can remember that behavior, but there will be some hit to that error message in your development mailing list archive from 5 years ago, and someone will have encountered it and actually tracked it down at that time. And that's tremendously time-saving for whoever's reporting that bug or who's going to maybe fix that bug. So in order for your archives to be open at all, it's best to have them open from the beginning. That way people know that everything they post should be crawlable by Google, searchable, and is going to be a resource in the future. People actually, when they're aware of this, they change the way that they write their mails. For example, they start quoting verbatim the output from the console log or from the debugging output of the program, because they know that the error message that they are quoting in there could be a hit in search results someday and help someone else. And the use of the archive and using permanent links, cross-links between things becomes a standard cultural practice in your project. This is a big one. We really find this with foundations and government agencies in particular. The code that you're writing may be open source, but you'll discover that the programmers, to save time, brought in, say, a proprietary charting library, a graph, making bar graphs and circle graphs and stuff. And now it's the day before you're supposed to go live, and you can't release under an open source license. It's not just that it might be proprietary. You can have situations where open source licenses are suitable for using the software on your own machines in combination with the code that you wrote under whatever open source license you have, because it doesn't matter if you're not distributing. The license doesn't matter then. But it's not suitable for outbound distribution together with your code under the license you wanted to release under. And if you're developing in the open from the beginning, you'll be aware of that. Somebody will point out, oh, hey, you're using, GNU General Public License here and some non-GPL compatible license here, and we can't, if we distribute under that, people cannot redistribute because this one has clauses that are not compatible with GPL. I'm not going to go into a big license geek throwdown on you. That's not why you came. But there are various subtle compatibility issues between some open source licenses. And it's very likely that if you're developing behind a closed door for a year and then you release, somebody's going to pull in some code that can't be released along with the project at some point. It is virtually always the case that when software is not exposed to people other than its authors, that the documentation for getting it up and running and debugging it and even deploying it to a production server is not sufficient. The developers who wrote it, they just know too much. I thought like, hey, I'm a professional open source developer. I've been doing this for 20 years. Look, I can write good documentation. I can make sure that the software that our company writes and releases open source is fine. And then one day we brought in someone, I can't remember which project this was. It was SwapTact, right? We brought in someone to launch SwapTact. Anyway, we brought in a third party to look at some code, and this person had to get it up and running, and our own install.md file was not sufficient. And we were trying as hard as we could, and there was still some steps missing. It's just inevitable. The people who wrote the code can't know what they don't know what they know. They don't realize how much background assumptions they are keeping in their heads. The reason that having your code be open from the beginning helps with that is that there are constantly people coming along and trying it out. And there's just this steady stream of little pings saying, oh yeah, you're missing a line in the README. You forgot to document the step where you copy the Tomcat config file from here to, and remove the .sample extension and put it over here, whatever it is. And your deployment documentation will be naturally kept up to date as long as there's a constant stream of people who don't know the code coming along and trying to launch it. So furthermore, we've also seen that in-house teams tend to use their in-house documentation systems, and whatever that might be, and even if that's not really how open source projects tend to do it. So open source projects tend to release documentation either in Markdown format or some plain text format, or sometimes in HTML, or that if they're really fancy, they write it in like DocBook or TechInfo, and then they export to HTML and PDF and stuff. But there are a bunch of standard conventions for what formats you use, what output formats you generate, how you distribute them, how you package them up and stuff. But if the team has been working in-house, they're just going to use whatever documentation format management uses or the legal team uses. And that could be like Microsoft, Word, which is fine if that's what you're using in-house, but for the open source world, it's going to send completely the wrong signal about getting involved in this project. Because the project very likely doesn't, if you didn't write the code in Microsoft Word, you're not expecting people to take Microsoft Word files and put them on the web for newcomers to the project to read, right? It's just the wrong kind of doc format for that. You will also find, one sec to get a drink of water. In addition to dependency libraries, there may be build time dependencies. For example, we just discovered that our software only builds using the proprietary compiler that we have, a special bunch of seat licenses for at the computing, the supercomputing center we happen to work at. But once you get it out there on the web, it won't just build with LLVM or GCC or whatever the programming language environment is. It's really surprisingly easy for non-free, meaning non-open source, build dependencies of some kind to creep into your project. And the last bit is that people cut fewer corners when they're developing in the open, because there are strangers who are coming along and looking at your code, or at least the potential for that. And so if you do something in a way where it's clear that an API was required, and by the way, I should have asked at the beginning, how many of you are programmers? Okay, good. And if I say words like API, diff, patch, commit, stuff like that, and it never works to ask someone, raise your hand if you don't understand those words, like who's going to raise their hand when I say that. But it looks like most of you will understand that. If you don't, it looks like you can ask the person next to you for a translation, so you'll be fine. When developing in-house code under deadlines imposed only by local management and without conversation that involves anyone outside the organization, the management hierarchy's priorities will take priority. And that means that programmers will start cutting corners to meet those internally imposed deadlines. Now, every project cuts corners. Compromise and trade-offs are in the nature of software development. There's no open source project that doesn't cut them as well. But the kinds of corners that tend to get cut when it's all done in-house is that API boundaries are not carefully maintained, partly because interacting with another problem, they're not sufficiently documented. And so when you don't have to document your API enough for a stranger to come along and actually use it, you tend to not think about the API as much and not even perhaps develop all of it. So you get modularity violations, code that's too interdependent in various ways. And essentially, it's a form of technical debt. It means the software, when it comes out of the gate, will not be as easy for other people to make extensions for as it would have been otherwise. So be open from day one. The second, that's all one class of mistake. We're going to keep this behind closed doors until the day we release. The second one, we hear this occasionally from government agencies, not as much as you would think. Many government agencies are quite friendly toward commercial activity, but from foundations. Like almost every time we've had a conversation with a foundation, a nonprofit charity that's trying to put some open source software out for some purpose, they are leery of for-profit vendors coming along and using the code for for-profit purposes. And we always have to have a conversation where we say, oh my gosh, no, like your project has completely succeeded if you see that happening, and it means that you're no longer the only point of failure. It means that there will be commercial support for people who want to adopt your software. I mean, you should want that. The equation that I always give is like money and non-monetary dedication is what makes open source software happen. That if you take out the money portion of that equation, it's very rare that the software can keep going for a long period of time. And even when you look at projects that are supposedly labors of love and do not have commercial interests backing them, you inevitably find that it's actually it's useful for people's day jobs. It turns out that it's being informally subsidized by a bunch of organizations that don't know they're subsidizing it because their programmers are actually spending time sending patches to this upstream project, and because it's effectively part of their job. Another principle is, and this is sort of much more social than technical, it's imagine yourself in the shoes of a newcomer, someone who comes along to your project. What are the things that person wants to do? Maybe they just want to see what it looks like, learn what the features are. Very low investment. They're not going to try to stand up an instance and develop it, debug, or throw their own data in it and see how it behaves. They just want to get a sense of what it does. So for that, the website should have an immediate reward, right? If you land there should be some screenshots, some explanation of what it does. You'd be surprised at how many projects, especially like, for example, some of the NPM, the Node.js, plugin projects or Ruby gems. You get on the page and they just assume you know what the plugin does. No, you have to tell people this is what this is for. These are the circumstances that you might want to use it. This helps people identify whether they are interested in it or not. Okay, the next step is, I want to try it out. So now the person has made a little bit more investment. They've put more of themselves into it. So it's appropriate that you can ask them to pay a little bit more attention and that they get correspondingly more reward. They can actually stand the thing up, load their data through some sort of ETL process. The general way to think of this is that in any project, if you have a step function where people have to put in effort and put in effort and put, I guess I'm going the opposite direction from the arrow, put in effort and put in effort and put in effort, and then finally something happens, like they're able to get a patch into the commit into the repository, they're able to get the attention of a developer in the bug tracker, but they first had to take it on faith, that's a high barrier community. If for every bit of increased effort they put in, then they start getting proportionally more reward in a continuous line. It doesn't have to be straight. I mean, it can be a slope with some sort of curve if you want, but it should be continuous, and it should never be that people have to go on faith that all this effort will be rewarded. Then you have a community that's welcoming to newcomers, and proportionally to newcomers, to the process of newcomers becoming more highly invested contributors. Be a good example would be if you find a bug in the software. Okay, if you use this thing every day and you're a programmer, there's a good chance, 1 out of 15 times or something, that person is going to say, I'm going to try to fix this bug. I've been running into this every time. I'm just going to try to fix it. How hard does the person have to work at that point to figure out how to build from source and how to send a change, a proposed change, along with the appropriate documentation, regression tests, and whatever, to the project? If it's as simple as, oh yeah, you read this one-page doc and you send us a pull request and someone will acknowledge it right away, you'll get an immediate response even if we can't review it. That's a low barrier. If it's, you've got to crawl around in the code, read a bunch of comments, and then go find someone in an IRC channel and like see if they'll pay any attention to your change, and then they don't really have a definite procedure, but they're like, yeah, you could do that and put it on the mailing list and maybe someone will respond. Someone's being asked to put in a lot of effort with no certainty that the procedure they're using is the right one. They're likely to just stop there and not even bother to fix the bug. And you can really see a difference. Projects that make an effort to be welcoming in that way, a LibreOffice is a great example of this. They get lots of contributed bug fixes and a fairly complex piece of software. Similarly with Mozilla Firefox, which has a whole team dedicated to making Firefox easier to hack on, they get lots of contributions. And not strictly from volunteers, like people who have really no monetary interest, but there are people who are able to justify taking salaried time from their day job to go do that, because Firefox makes it easy. If you have a large organization, I don't know how large NCSA is, I don't know that all of you are at NCSA particularly, but in large organizations, open source collaboration doesn't just open up the software development process to the possibility of external contributions. It also opens it up to contributions from within the organization, but outside the standard development team hierarchy. So whatever your org chart is, it starts to look like this once you're doing open source development. Just not in the normal realm of authority, but in the open source development part. And that's actually fine. To my surprise, one of the things we found when we started doing this consulting was that one of the best organizations in the US government at doing this is the Department of Defense. You would think of them as like having these absolutely rigid hierarchical lines, and information may only flow among the lines, and it would never happen that like someone over here would get a pull request from someone over there. But actually, because they realized early on that this was a cultural barrier in the DoD to open source dynamics, a bunch of people started working on this and inculcating principles of like anyone can submit a patch, anyone can check out the code. The org chart is not part of this process. It doesn't mean that managers don't assign developers to specific tasks. They do. There is management going on, but there's no point in having a barrier to anyone participating if they have the time and the inclination to do so. And one thing I always say to organizations is like, suppose something gets messed up. We have version control. You just roll back the change. Have a bunch of committers get together and say, oh, that was ill-advised, and diplomatically explain to the person who committed it why we're reverting it and roll it back. You're never going to lose any data. You're never going to lose track of the last known working version. So think audit trails, not gateways. There's no need for a gateway if you have audit trails. Have any of you ever visited bikeshed.com? Oh, I see some hands nodding. Oh, I'm so delighted. Every technical project, not just software, I mean any collaborative project using human beings, is going to have two kinds of arguments. Ones that actually matter, and then the other kind where people just need to prove that they're in the room and have an opinion and that they should be taken seriously. And a great many of the discussions in an open source project are of that latter kind. This is known as bike shedding, from a very famous post written by Paul Henning Kamp on the FreeBSD or OpenBSD, one of the BSD Linux, BSD Unix, a little slip of the tongue, mailing lists, in which he said, like, if you take to your local zoning board the plans to build a nuclear power plant and have them approve or disapprove it, everyone in the room is just going to say, yeah, go for it, green light, because they don't understand what's involved in a nuclear power plant, and they figure if you got the proposal this far, you must know what you're doing, and so they shouldn't stand in the way of that, and so you can go build your nuclear power plant. But come to them with a proposal to build a bike shed in your backyard, everyone on the council is going to start asking what color you plan to paint it, because this is something that's small enough that they can understand and have an opinion, even though it's totally unimportant. And so they will have an opinion, and you will never get your bike shed built. A lot of discussions, and all these URLs actually work, by the way, and they have these effects. A lot of discussions in open source projects are like that. When I address you here, I'm assuming that you are in some sort of leadership or initiator position in the project. It is most important for people who are seen as leaders in a project to conspicuously lose bike shed arguments from time to time. You should actually go ahead and be Machiavellian. Pick the argument and plan to lose it. Go in with an opinion and then say, oh, no, but this isn't such a big deal and I can see that there are good arguments your way. Let's go ahead and do it your way. You are setting a cultural example that will be very valuable for other people in the project. I mean, programming tends to attract people who, they have very set ideas of how things should work, right? That is our mentality generally as programmers. Not everyone, but there's sort of a statistical preponderance of that kind of personality type. You need to demonstrate to those people that it's okay to let go of the ideal way to do something and go with an 80% just as good solution. Because for someone else, the trade-off might be that that's the perfect way and the other way is 80%. So lose those arguments, don't be afraid. It won't matter in the long run of your project, and it will do a great deal of good for the project's culture. Here is, I'm going to do a quick time check. 20 minutes, good. Here I'm going to do something you should never do during a live talk, which is we're going to go to a web page, and we're going to assume the internet connection is still working as it was when I began talking. One of the things that I've become more and more convinced of as I've watched more open source projects and been involved in more is that when the project leadership, or project sponsors, I should say, those who are in the position of being most likely to decide to make larger investments in the project for whatever reason, organizational type investments, when they spend more time on building good collaboration infrastructure, good tooling to help people work together, the rewards for the project are greater than you would expect, and it's almost always worth it. So I'm just going to give you a trivial example of one that we did a long time ago in the Subversion project. This is probably no longer the best example. It's just the one that I happen to have in my head and I've had slides for. So we had this problem where when we were trying to find new committers, like who has been contributing a lot and really should be offered what we now call push access to the repository, but was called commit access because Subversion works that way. Who should we offer to? Well, in the early days of the project, everyone just knew in their head, like, oh yeah, so-and-so has been contributing patches for a while. She's always, willing to enter a good technical discussion. Her patches do the job. She always includes regression tests. Somebody just offer her full commit access already, so we don't have to keep reviewing this stuff before commit. We can review it after commit. We can always roll it back, right? But as the project grew, it became the case that not every committer knew every existing committer knew every contributor, and even those who worked with a particular contributor might not remember it because they'd worked with so many at that point. I mean, there were literally hundreds in the project at a certain point, and you just couldn't keep that all in your head. It's way past Dunbar's number. So the solution we came up with was we're going to have a convention when we receive a contribution, we incorporate it into the code. The commit message is going to have a certain convention. It's going to say patch by colon and then the person's name and email address, reviewed by colon someone, bug found by, and there are like 5 key phrases like that, each one on a line by itself, followed by a person's name. And we actually went back through the commit logs and like redid them all. In Subversion you can do that. In Git you can't, but there are other things you could do that would make it work in Git, like Git notes. Went through, and for every commit that had someone's name in it where they were actually the one who wrote the patch and it had been informally notated, we changed it to this new formal notation. And then we wrote, and this took like a day, day and a half, and then writing this new program took like a day roughly. So and then there was some cleanup and some explaining it and documenting it. So like I took most of a week off to make this happen. I was a full-time programmer in the project. That was a serious investment for CollabNet, my employer, to have me not code and not do much community management for most of a week to do this instead. But the result was, now we've got this thing that trawls over the entire commit history of the project every hour and just generates a page saying what person who is not already a full committer, that is a maintainer, an official maintainer, has been contributing and how. And if we just go over some of this list, like let's see, first of all, you can see why we were having a problem keeping track of who was doing what. That's it. Oh, it passed 1,000. That's great. So here's a completely random selection. I didn't even look at this before this presentation. So this person at this column here, and maybe the laser point will be better, they found a bug resulting in that commit. They submitted patches for all of these, and they reviewed these. And then here are the details. Here are the log messages, and you can see found by Justin Eckhurst, patched by Justin and me, and received by Mitchell. So this person is a partial committer, which is why their name is there. If you go to Justin Eckhurst in that previous list we were on, you will see there's an entry. We will try that in a moment. But so, okay, you want the details? You want to drill down a little bit? Okay, there's that commit, and there's what the person did, and you can actually go see the diff. I guess if we click there, it'll show us the diff, probably. Looks like it's working. Who says stuff never goes right during a demo? So for anything that person did, if you're trying to refresh your memory, if you're one of the maintainers, you're like, yeah, Raman Gupta, I remember that name, seemed pretty clueful on the list, but I don't really remember what he or she was doing. They just go to the contribulizer and they start trawling around in that person's contribution history, and they're like, oh yes, this refreshes my memory. The point is not to be a formal log of every contribution. The point is to be an aide-de-memoire to the committers to help them know when to offer someone greater control in the project. So I won't take your time to go back and look for Justin Eckhurst, but trust me, he's in there. Whoops. There, okay. So that's just one example. It really makes sense to look for the places where people are doing things manually that could be automated, and especially where that thing that they're doing manually impedes collaboration. Another great example, of course, is setting up a build farm, where when someone commits something that breaks the build, there's a little picture, it goes up in flames, continuous integration servers. That stuff takes some time to set up. It takes time to configure it in a way that's meaningful for your project. But once you have it, you've created a collaboration tool. It's not just that it's telling that individual committer, oh, hey, you broke the build. It's telling everyone else, so-and-so broke the build, go tease that person in IRC or somewhere and have them go fix it, right? You're giving people a surface area to which social interactions may adhere, and that's the thing an open source project needs the most. That random picture was supposed to remind me of something really important on the next slide. I totally don't remember what. Yes, okay. So we just talked about collaboration infrastructure. So this is just a list of some of the things you need. It doesn't matter. I mean, Git is sort of the standard these days. Mercurial is just as good. Personally, although I worked on the project, I think that distributed version control is a better solution for open source projects than centralized the way Subversion is. So go with Git or Mercurial or one of the more exotic decentralized ones, if that's what you like. Subversion is perfectly workable, but it absolutely must be under public version control. That like to run an open source project without that is, you're not running an open source project. Like that's just, you can't do it anymore. Bug tracker, public, do what you need for spam prevention, but people should be able to easily file comments in there. Most projects these days are just using GitHub. GitLab.com is catching up quickly, and there are a bunch of other hosting sites. Again, it doesn't really matter which one. Just have a public bug tracker. Web pages and wiki. For your mailing list, or mailing lists and online discussion forums are really the same thing. They're persistent archived threads with individual posts in one thread at a time. And I would generally advise having the mailing list gateway to an online forum for people who don't want to receive it by email. But do have it available by email for those who want it, because some really hardcore developers process everything, like even bug reports, by email. So tools that gateway to email are really winning in attracting kind of A-team developers who are used to have tweaked their mail clients to process everything. They will feel taken care of and are more likely to participate in that kind of project. I think that a real-time chat system is very important. IRC, believe it or not, is still the ruling technology in that, but some projects are trying out Mattermost, Slack. There's another one called River with a Y, I think, but I haven't seen it lately, so maybe they got eaten by Slack. Not sure what happened. But have some kind of real-time chat, and with all these tools, please do not require that your participants install proprietary software in order to use them. If they have to download a proprietary app of some kind in order to participate in the project, that's a real turnoff for a lot of open source developers. Proprietary JavaScript being loaded into your browser tab is the exception everyone seems to be willing to make, I think because of browser security boundaries, but that's as far as it should go. Again, I talked about buildbots and development servers. Development servers there doesn't just mean continuous integration servers. For particularly complex projects where a person's laptop is not likely to have the resources to deploy the thing itself, or it's just a very complex deployment process, something some projects do is they have push-button servers where you've automated the process of deploying the latest head of the code tree, the latest version at all times, and setting up an environment where someone can reproduce a bug, try a fix. They can go right into the code tree, try the fix, rebuild, hit deploy, and do this all on this development sandbox server that you've made available. And then when they're done, they click a button, pull request gets made, everything gets archived and packaged and sent to the project, and the development server vanishes because it was just a virtual machine. That takes a little bit of time and effort to set up. For very complex projects, it is certainly worth it. Social infrastructure, I'm going to really try hard not to do that thing where the presenter reads off the slides and everyone falls asleep because you can already read. But the main thing is think as much about how people in your project are interacting as you do about technical concerns of an individual developer working with the code. People working with your project are not just working with the code, they are working with all the other people working with the code. So good data to gather, for example, is if you're wondering about the health of your project, don't look in the repository, don't look at the commit history. I mean, that's interesting, and it certainly is very relevant for the code, but look in your bug tracker and look to see not just the rate of bug filings, but look to see who is responding to whom. When someone files a new bug report, is it always one of the core maintainers who responds, or is it someone else outside who you don't think of as someone who's a maintainer in the project, who is just following it and is interested enough to have subscribed to bug tracker notifications and is willing to help out by answering newbie questions or fielding bug reports? Now you've got a potential volunteer who maybe has never coded, or at least not coded on this project, but they're willing to help unduplicate, prevent duplicate filings in the bug tracker, interact with other newcomers, steer them in the right direction. You can tell a lot about how much people are willing to put into your project by watching how they talk to each other and what they do in your bug tracker. It's definitely like if I had to pick one thing to look at to evaluate a project's health, it would not be the mailing list, it would not be the code repository, it would definitely be the bug tracker. And GitHub and most issue trackers have APIs now. And there are scripts, Bitergia.com has some, there are various other ones floating around on Stack Overflow, where you can use the bug tracker API to do queries about these kinds of interactions and sort of get the social graph of what's happening in your bug tracker. Those tools aren't highly developed yet. I would predict that they are going to become more developed over time. The middle item there is that if you have a situation where only the founders of the project enforce social norms, such as, I mean, a very common one to have to enforce is, hey, no ad hominem attacks on the mailing list. Like, please keep your discussion to technical points. It's okay to disagree, but if you call someone stupid, that's not a technical point about the code. That's a point about them, and that's out of bounds. People fall into that stuff really easily. So you want to set the tone early by calling it out politely, firmly, and always as part of a larger discussion. But you do want to stop it, nip it in the bud. But more importantly, you want to empower other people to do the same. Once the group culture starts enforcing that, you can step back and you don't have to be the culture police all the time. And you can really see with projects, I mean, I don't know how many of you anyone follow Linux kernel development? No, okay, so you may or may not know that Linus, although a brilliant programmer, and definitely like one of the driving forces in open source, not just for Linux, but also for Git, is a rather nasty man on the mailing list. And there are a number of people who stopped contributing to the Linux kernel because they just are like, I can't take the atmosphere here. Linus is personally insulting me. I'm watching him personally insult other people. And that culture has become the norm among other developers. So now it's not just Linus doing it, it's other people kind of talking to each other the same way, although not with the same harshness that Linus does. This has been discussed in so many public articles that I don't mind talking about it here. And he's aware of the criticism and has decided that his personality is what it is and that's the way he's going to be. I don't think it's a good way for a project to be. I think it's like spraying contributor repellent on your project, and don't do that. So you want to set a polite and welcoming tone. You may want to have a formal code of conduct, although many projects don't. But the main thing is get other people involved in maintaining that tone over time. And when you step away, it'll be fine. I mean, I stepped out of the Subversion project 10 years ago, and whenever I go back and look, the mailing list discussions are super constructive, everyone's being polite, and all the sort of informal codes of conduct that we established early on are still being maintained, even though it's very few of the original committers who are still active in the project. We've already talked about audit trails instead of gateways. I think that's that. Some pitfalls not to fall into. Many people, especially again when we talk to governments and foundations, they think, okay, we've got to think of a governance structure for our project. Like, is it going to be voting? Is there going to be a project governance council? And how do you get on it? And we're like, just get some working code out there. You don't need to think about governance. A way to think of this is, in the middle of my sentence, quick time check. Oh, there's a clock back there. I could have been using it all along. Okay. All right. Yeah, we're very near the end now, and there'll be some time for Q&A, I hope. A way to think about this is that governance and politics are a thing you need for rivalrous resources, for non-replicable resources. You have to have a decision-making procedure for how to allocate land and the use of physical objects, because you can't replicate those at no cost, and you can't just fork them and move on. So there has to be some procedure. Like if I'm going to get on that bicycle and ride it, the world has to agree that I'm the owner of that bicycle, or that I have the right to do so. And we have a whole system of property management and decision-making to handle those situations. Open source doesn't need that, because anyone who's not happy can fork the code and go take the project somewhere else and see who follows them. Maybe they'll succeed, maybe they'll fail. It's gone both ways in history. But you do not need the same kind of strict governance procedures in a world where resources can be infinitely replicated. So do not worry about governance early on in your project. Be prepared to suggest a voting system to make decision-making easier. And I talk about that some in the book. You can look at it online if you want. But it should never be your first concern. Try not to let discussions in your internal development team devolve into back-channel, like private emails. If that starts happening and you're part of that private email thread, say, wait, why are we discussing this here? Take it to the public list, take it to the bug tracker. Like, we don't want to have a cabal behind the scenes, except for things where it's absolutely necessary, and sometimes it is, but usually it's not. Expecting distraction is people often think that if they open source their code, all of a sudden during the development process, their dev team is going to get distracted by questions coming in from random strangers on the outside, and you'll have to review all these people's code patches, and you won't get anything done because you'll have this community managed. It's totally up to you. You are not ever obligated to respond to someone's question, even to their pull request. You should do so when it is to your advantage. I'm not even saying to the project's advantage. If those people want to fork the project, they're welcome to. You should respond to those things when it is to your advantage to do so. And if your goal is the health of the project, you will often find that it is to your advantage to do so. That's fine. But the distraction is totally your choice. You open source your code. You do not open source your time and attention, or your team's time and attention. And this waiting for code to be perfect before you open source it, so obviously bad, I don't even need to say more about it. Okay, I think you are ready to take over the world. That's it. I think we have a little time for Q&A. That's it. Thanks so much for listening. And actually, I'm going to start the Q&A by asking you a question. How many of you are participants in open source projects right now? Maybe I should have asked that at the beginning. That's great to see. Cool. I can do questions. I guess there's a mic back there. Oh, yeah.
So do you have any specific advice for projects whose primary route for new contributors the new contributors are mostly like scientists, not necessarily programmers?
Yeah.
How to make things easier for them?
Is there any advice for projects where the contributors are scientists, or by which you mean people who sort of learn programming on the side as part of their real job, but they don't consider themselves professional programmers, right? Yeah, more hand-holding. Specifically, they tend to be insecure about their code. It comes in with a lot of apologies usually, or they do things in a way that's not up to what programmers would consider professional standards. And I would say take their code in, give them lots of review, pay attention, thank them for it. It's just take a little more time. If you think their contributions are worth it, or you like them, do it. But yeah, we have a number of projects like that, and I've worked on some as a programmer, and I just found that if my usual community management overhead was like this much for normal programmers, it sort of went to be that much when it was a non-typical programmer making a contribution. It was totally worth it. They came back for more because the hand-holding helped. So I would just say spend a little bit more time and attention. Anything else? Doug?
You mentioned that you were surprised You mentioned that you were surprised that the DoD was a place where there was less rigid structure imposed upon how people interacted with each other. Do you have any insights as to what they did right to make that happen, or what other organizations did wrong to stifle that?
My family doesn't have any military background. I was never part of the anything related to the DoD until giving some presentations at their conferences and things like that. So I don't know anything except what I read in like the Atlantic Monthly about how the military works, right? But my understanding is that there has always been a tradition of interest groups forming in all the branches of the service and in the civilian DoD, of when there's a goal that a bunch of people see something in common, they're very free to make some kind of special interest group and try to make it happen. And that's not usually shut down unless it's looking like it's actually like against policy. And what happened was a group called MIL-OSS, Military Open Source Software, formed very early, I think informally, and then they formally actually have a website, mil-oss.org, with great resources on it. And they started meeting regularly and trading notes and formalizing things. So what they would do is first they noticed that, hey, one of the problems we have getting open source in the door, even not just us writing it, but being able to use stuff we pull off GitHub under open source licenses, is that the procurement officers don't realize that open source qualifies as commercial off-the-shelf software, which in the federal and defense acquisition regulations is a really important thing. Being COTS, commercial off-the-shelf, is like this big deal that smooths the way for a procurement. And so they got a bunch of people who were expert in procurement policy and software to write presentations and memos, and eventually those memos got put out by the CIOs of various branches saying, yes, open source must be considered, it is COTS, you do not have to do anything special, you find commercial support for it in the same way you find commercial support for anything. And once those messages started circulating, and it was kind of a horizontal and then vertical rather than from the top and then everyone got it from some person at the top. Once that started circulating, everyone got the message that, oh, open source is something we can use and therefore we can participate in. And also this group developed a lot of contacts and had a route now to spread the word about the next policy or the next recommendation. So it was a typical special interest group in the DoD that just happened to be fairly long-lived and is still quite successful. Did that answer your actual question?
Yeah.
Good. Go ahead.
So what's your advice to integrate software testing procedures with the source code repository?
Oh, what's my advice for integrating software testing procedures with the source code repository? Did I hear that correctly?
Right.
So, I mean, open source software is not technically different from other software, right? You should typically, you have a regression test suite and or unit test suite in the code tree. And it's very important that those tests be in the same code tree in the repository. You set up your continuous integration servers to run them, run both suites after every commit, right? And to show when someone has caused some tests to fail that were not failing before. And then the social implication of that is that people should be instructed that writing the appropriate test is part of fixing a bug. And in fact, writing the test first is the textbook way to do it. And I've seen this succeed in projects where the maintainers took the trouble to make the test suite easy enough to write new tests in. So it's not like hooking up tests together and making sure your build-bot system works or whatever. That's something any project can do. What's different about open source is making sure that it's as easy as possible. It's very well documented and fairly trivial to write new tests, because then when your developers tell newcomers, hey, that's a great patch, but where's the test? Can you write the test first, and then then we can really verify this. They don't just walk away thinking, well, you've just added another 8 hours to my task. They look and they say, oh, okay, so another hour, I'll do that, but now I'm part of the club. So it's a really social advice, I would say.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.